There is a certain kind of neighbor, and you know the type, who discovers the HOA rulebook the way some people discover religion, late in life, terrifying conviction. Suddenly everything is a sin, and they have been personally appointed to collect. Sandra Pruitt found her calling on the third Tuesday of September, when she was elected to the Maplewood Ridge Community Association Board by a margin of 11 votes. 11. In a community of 214 homes, that is not a mandate, that is a quorum technicality. But Sandra Pruitt did not see it that way. Sandra Pruitt saw a throne. What happened next? The fines, the inspections, the garage dispute that somehow became the most watched local news segment in Denton County in 4 years, did not begin with malice, exactly. Began with a Mercedes-Benz C-Class in the wrong parking spot, and it ended with epoxy. Drop your city and tell me, do you live in an HOA? I want to know how many are watching from behind enemy lines right now. Maplewood Ridge sits in the northwest corner of Crestfield, Ohio, roughly 20 minutes from downtown if the lights cooperate. It is the kind of subdivision that was built in 2003, with a lot of architectural enthusiasm, and has been gently decaying ever since, not badly, not dramatically, but in the way that all planned communities eventually reveal the distance between the developer's brochure and the actual passage of time. The oak trees that were planted as saplings are now magnificent and inappropriate. The fountains in the retention ponds work about 60% of the time. Brick pavers along Winding Elm Court have developed a slight ripple that the HOA has been meaning to address since 2017. 214 single-family homes, monthly assessments of $287, which generate roughly $60,000 a month in operating revenue, which the board has historically managed with all the financial sophistication of someone paying bills from a shoebox. Marcus Webb moved into 4412 Winding Elm Court in late April of that same year. He was 37, recently divorced, worked remotely as a technical project manager for a logistics software company based out of Charlotte. He had specifically looked for a house with a large attached garage because he owned 2 motorcycles and a restored 1974 Ford Bronco that he had no intention of parking in a driveway where children might touch it. The garage at 4412 was a 2-car, technically, though it ran deeper than standard, 14 feet deep on the left bay, which Marcus had immediately identified as the reason he made an offer $8,000 over asking. He was not a difficult person. He introduced himself to his immediate neighbors. He brought a bottle of wine to the Okafor family on his left and a 6-pack of craft beer to the B. Delgado Williamses on his right. He read the CC&Rs, all 47 pages of the Maplewood Ridge Community Association amended and restated, declaration of covenants, conditions, and restrictions, recorded with the Denton County Recorder's Office in 2009, because he had once, previous life in a previous suburb, been blindsided by a $400 fine for storing recycling bins in the wrong orientation. He had vowed never again. The CC&Rs were unremarkable. No parking commercial vehicles in driveways. No exterior paint changes without Architectural Review Committee approval. No recreational equipment visible from the street. Grass to be maintained between 2 and 4 inches. Garbage bins to be stored out of sight except within 24 hours of pickup. Standard suburban commandments. Marcus noted them, committed them roughly to memory, and got on with his life. He had no particular opinion about the Maplewood Ridge Community Association in those first weeks. It was an HOA, it existed. He paid his assessment. These things were facts like property taxes and the inevitability of gutter cleaning. Then he met Sandra Pruitt. Sandra lived at 4408 Winding Elm Court, directly next door to Marcus on his right, 4-bedroom colonial that she had owned since 2011. And maintained with an intensity that suggested she had confused homeownership with performance art. Her lawn was immaculate. Her flower beds were seasonally coordinated. Her driveway was resealed every other spring. She drove a silver 2021 Mercedes-Benz C300 that she kept in her garage with the same reverence most people reserve for religious artifacts. She had been a member of the Maplewood Ridge Community Association Board since 2019, first as an at-large member, then, as of that September, as the newly elected president. Sandra Pruitt was 51 years old, worked as a regional compliance officer for a healthcare billing company, and had the specific energy of someone who had been told they were very detail-oriented their whole life and had decided that this was a personality. She noticed things. She tracked things. She had a mental file on every property in the immediate vicinity of 4408 Winding Elm Court. She updated it constantly, the way a researcher updates a database. Except the database was her neighbor's front yards. The research question was, what can I cite them for? Marcus Webb had not been on her radar in April. In May, he registered as a mild concern. She had clocked the motorcycles, which were stored inside the garage and therefore not a violation, but she had noted them. In June, he became a moderate concern because he had parked the Bronco in his driveway for 3 consecutive days while working on the rear differential, and she had filed a courtesy notice with the previous board about unsightly vehicle storage. Courtesy notice had gone nowhere because the previous board president, a retired engineer named Phil Kowalski, had reviewed the situation, noted that the vehicle was registered, operable, and on private property, filed Sandra's complaint in what he later described to his wife as the circular filing system. Phil Kowalski retired from the board in August. Sandra Pruitt was elected president in September. The balance of power at Maplewood Ridge shifted in ways that would not become fully apparent until October. Now that you know Marcus, has your HOA ever pulled something that made your blood boil? Tell me the worst thing your HOA has done. The first notice arrived on a Thursday, October 14th. It was delivered to Marcus Webb's door in a sealed envelope marked Official Community Association Notice, Time Sensitive, which Marcus opened while eating cereal and standing at his kitchen counter, because he was that kind of person. The notice cited a violation of Section 6.4 of the Maplewood Ridge CC&Rs Prohibited Vehicles and Parking Standards. Specifically, it alleged that Marcus had been parking a recreational vehicle, defined in the CC&Rs as any vehicle used primarily for leisure or sporting activity, on his driveway between the hours of 7 a.m. and 9 p.m. on dates visible from the street. The fine was $150, payable within 30 days, with an additional $75 per day for continued violations. Marcus read this twice. Then he read Section 6.4b of the CC&R, which he had already read in April. Section 6.4 did indeed prohibit recreational vehicles from driveway parking during those hours. What it did not define was a 1974 Ford Bronco as a recreational vehicle. The CC&Rs defined recreational vehicles on page 31 in Section 2 definitions: motorized vehicles designed and manufactured primarily for recreational use, including but not limited to ATVs, snowmobiles, golf carts, personal watercraft trailers, and designated RV-class vehicles over 22 feet in length. The Bronco was not 22 feet long. It was not a snowmobile. It was a truck, a vintage, restored, privately owned truck that Marcus Webb used to drive to the grocery store and, occasionally, on camping weekends, which did not make it a recreational vehicle by any definition that had ever appeared in an English language dictionary or a legally recorded HOA document. Marcus wrote a polite response. He quoted Section 2 of the CC&Rs. He noted that the Bronco was a passenger vehicle under Ohio Revised Code, Section 4501.01. He included a photograph of the vehicle's title, which listed its classification as a light-duty pickup truck. He mailed the response to the Maplewood Ridge Community Association, P.O. box and considered the matter closed. The matter was not closed. On October 28th, a second notice arrived. This one cited the same violation, doubled the fine to $300, and added a new citation. Section 7, Aesthetic Maintenance Standards, Driveways. The new citation alleged that Marcus's driveway had visible oil stains constituting a maintenance violation. The fine for this was an additional $200. Total outstanding balance, $500. Marcus walked to his driveway. He examined the concrete. There was a faint discoloration near the garage door, roughly 18 inches in diameter, pale gray against the slightly paler gray of the concrete, the kind of mark that existed on approximately 90% of residential driveways in Crestfield, Ohio, which required close examination and prior motivation to identify as anything other than the natural weathering of a 12-year-old concrete slab. He power washed it. He sent photographs. He again disputed the vehicle classification. He again mailed a written response. On November 9th, the third notice arrived. The Bronco violation had been recited. Apparently, his written disputes had not been received as valid challenges because no formal hearing had been requested, and the oil stain was cited again despite the photographs. There was also a new violation. Section 9. Common area usage and interference. This one alleged that Marcus's garbage bins had been placed at the curb at 5:30 p.m. on November 7th, rather than after 7 p.m. as specified, constituting early placement. Marcus checked the CC&Rs Section 9. One did indeed specify that garbage bins could not be placed at the curb earlier than 7 p.m. the evening before collection. Garbage collection at Maplewood Ridge occurred on Tuesdays. November 7th was a Sunday. There was no garbage collection on Monday, November 8th. Marcus hadn't put his bins out on Sunday, November 7th. He had put them out on Monday, November 8th at approximately 6:45 p.m., Tuesday collection. And even if the time had been 5:30 p.m. rather than 6:45 p.m., the notice had the wrong date by an entire day. The fine was $125. Total outstanding balance, $625. He requested a formal hearing before the board, as was his right under Section 14.2 of the CC&Rs. The hearing was scheduled for November 18th at the Maplewood Ridge Clubhouse, 7 p.m. Marcus Webb showed up with a manila folder, highlighted copy of the CC&Rs, and the quiet determination of a man who had read enough documents in his professional life to know when someone was improvising. The board meeting was already in session when Marcus arrived, which he noted because the agenda posted on the community bulletin board had listed the hearing items beginning at 7:15 p.m., and it was 7:08 p.m. 3 of the 5 board members were present. Sandra Pruitt sat at the center of the folding table at the front of the clubhouse, flanked by the treasurer, a man named Gary Feld, who looked as though he had been somewhere else for the entire meeting. A newer board member named Cheryl Eaton, who took notes with the focused energy of someone who found the situation significantly more interesting than Gary did. Marcus sat across from them. He presented his case methodically. He cited Section 2. He provided the vehicle title. He provided the power wash driveway photographs, time-stamped. He provided his phone's location history, showing he had not been home on November 7th, placing the bin placement date in question. He was courteous. He was precise. Sandra Pruitt listened with the expression of someone who had already decided the outcome and was waiting for the other person to finish talking. The board voted 3-0 to uphold all 3 violations. Marcus's total outstanding assessment balance, including fines, was now $625. 30 days to pay before the account would be referred to the association's collection attorney, and a lien could be placed against the property. Marcus drove home, sat in his kitchen for a long time, and looked at his garage. That was the night things changed. Let me be precise about what happened next, because the sequence of events matters. It is easy, in retrospect, to read what Marcus Webb did as an escalation. It was not. It was a response. There is a difference, and the difference is important. Marcus understood it even at the time, which is what allowed him to execute with such calm. He began by spending $47 on an audio-video capable doorbell camera and 2 additional side-mounted security cameras, which he installed on November 19th, the morning after the board meeting. These cameras covered his entire driveway, both side yards to the property line and the front approach to his garage. They were motion-activated, cloud-backed, and recorded in 4K. He then submitted a formal written request to the Maplewood Ridge Community Association under Ohio Revised Code, Section 5312-10, which governed homeowner rights to inspect association records, requesting copies of all fine notices issued in the past 24 months, all board meeting minutes for the past 3 years, all correspondence between board members regarding his property, all architectural review committee decisions issued in the past 12 months. He gave the board the statutory 15-day response window. He also, quietly and without announcement, knocked on some doors. The Okafor family at 4414 Winding Elm Court had received 2 notices in October, one for a basketball hoop visible from the street, which had been there for 6 years without comment, one for a decorative stone garden border that allegedly violated Section 8.3 exterior landscaping materials. Total fines, $350. The Delgado-Williams household at 4410 had received a notice about their front door color, a deep teal that Renata Delgado-Williams had specifically submitted for ARC approval 18 months earlier, received no response on, installed under the CC&Rs provision that unreturned ARC applications were deemed approved after 60 days. The board's position, per the notice, was that no such approval had been granted. Fine, $400 plus $100 per day for continued violation. A retired couple at 4403, the Hendersons, received a fine for wind chimes under an alleged noise ordinance provision that Marcus could not locate in any version of the CC&Rs he could find. Not the 2009 recorded version, not the 2014 amendment, not the 2019 amendment. When he asked Barbara Henderson to show him her copy, hers didn't contain it either. The fine was $175. By the time Marcus had walked the length of Winding Elm Court and circled back, he had documented 11 households that had received fine notices since Sandra Pruitt assumed the presidency in September, a period of approximately 6 weeks. The total fines issued across those 11 households came to $4,840. None of the fines had been issued during Phil Kowalski's tenure in the preceding 6 months. 11 households. 6 weeks, $4,840. 0 violations issued in the 6 months prior. Marcus Webb opened a spreadsheet. He was, professionally, a project manager. He knew what a data pattern looked like. He noted something else in the data. Of the 11 households cited, 10 had properties that backed up or neighbored Sandra Pruitt's direct sightline. The 11th, a household on the far end of the street, had recently submitted a request to install solar panels on their south-facing roof, a request that Sandra had, in her capacity as ARC chairperson. She had appointed herself to that role in addition to the presidency, which Marcus noted was permitted but unusual, rejected in writing on the basis that solar panels may negatively affect community aesthetic standards, a rejection that was almost certainly in violation of Ohio's Solar Access Law, Section 4796-03. The record's request came back on December 4th, partially. The association's management company, Keystone Property Solutions, sent over 2 years of fine notices and the last 18 months of meeting minutes. The prior board correspondence, they noted, was not available for member inspection under a board confidentiality claim. Marcus flagged that, under Ohio Revised Code Section 5312.10, member financial and enforcement records were not subject to board confidentiality unless they pertained to pending litigation. None of the properties in question had pending litigation. He wrote back, citing the statute. Keystone forwarded his letter to the board. Sandra Pruitt did not respond. What she did instead, and this is where the story pivots, was park her car in Marcus Webb's garage. Here is the context, because context is everything. Marcus had a shared driveway easement with 4408. The Pruitt property predated both of their ownerships. It was a standard access easement recorded with the county, allowing either property to use the shared apron at the base of both driveways for vehicle turnaround purposes. It was a 15-foot strip, was not a parking space, it was not a garage, it was an ingress-egress accommodation, and it had existed peacefully since 2005 without incident. On December 11th, a Saturday morning, Marcus walked into his garage at approximately 9 a.m. to start the Bronco for a morning drive. The garage door was closed. He hit the opener, the door rolled up, and there in the left bay of his garage, the deep bay, the 14-foot bay, the one specifically selected for its dimensions, was Sandra Pruitt's 2021 Mercedes-Benz C300. It was parked neatly, all the way in Marcus's private garage on his deeded private property. His garage door had a keypad, which he had not changed from the factory default when he moved in. Because factory defaults are a vulnerability that most people do not think about until someone else exploits them. He stood in the doorway of his own garage for a long moment, looking at someone else's car in his space. Then he took photographs, extensive, time-stamped geotagged photographs. He noted the time, 9:04 a.m. He noted the vehicle, Ohio plates, registered to Sandra L. Pruitt, 4408 Winding Elm Court. He documented the position of the vehicle relative to the garage walls, the placement of the front bumper relative to the interior back wall. The fact that the vehicle was parked in a manner that occupied the entire left bay and made access to his Bronco, which was in the right bay, possible but tight. He called Sandra Pruitt's phone number, which he had from the association directory. She did not answer. He left a voicemail noting, in level tones, that her vehicle appeared to be parked in his private garage and asking her to remove it at her earliest convenience. He waited 2 hours. At 11:15 a.m., Marcus Webb changed the garage door keypad code. He programmed a new code known only to himself. He then went inside, a second cup of coffee, and consulted an attorney he had already, as of the previous week, retained on a preliminary basis. Crestfield-based real estate and community association attorney named David Kessler, who had been practicing in Denton County for 22 years and had the specific energy of someone who had seen this exact type of situation before, different variations, and had long since stopped being surprised. David Kessler's advice, delivered by text at 11:48 a.m., was, "Don't touch her car. Don't damage it. Document everything. You can legally prevent her from removing it until she contacts you directly. Then we negotiate. But do not seal the garage. That creates a different problem. $625 in disputed fines." Against Marcus, is this legal where you live? What would you have done? Now, here is the thing about Marcus Webb, and the thing about advice, the thing about reaching a point where the rational calculus of legal strategy begins to compete with the visceral satisfaction of doing something that simply, completely, and irreversibly communicates how done you are. Marcus did not seal the garage in the way that phrase implies. He did not weld it shut. He did not pour concrete in the tracks. What Marcus Webb did, and what David Kessler had technically, not specifically, prohibited, because the specificity of legal advice is always a function of the specificity of the question, was apply to the exterior of his garage door a product called Permaset Industrial Exterior Epoxy Sealant, which was marketed for concrete and metal bonding applications, and which, when applied to the joint between a steel garage door and a steel garage door frame, created a bond of approximately 3,200 pounds per square inch. Applied it to the bottom edge of the door. He applied it to both side seams. He applied it at 12:30 p.m. on December 11th, in the daylight, with an unhurried and methodical attention to coverage that suggested he had read the product instructions carefully. The Mercedes-Benz C300 was inside. Marcus Webb then sat on his front porch in a winter coat with a cup of coffee and waited. Sandra Pruitt emerged from her house at 2:17 p.m. with her keys. She crossed the shared apron. She pressed her remote. Nothing happened. She pressed it again. She walked to the keypad. She punched in the old code. Nothing happened. She tried 3 variations of the old code. Nothing happened. She walked around to the side of the garage. She tried the side door, which Marcus had locked. She walked back to the front. She looked at the door. She looked at Marcus sitting on his porch. "I need to get my car," Sandra Pruitt said. "I know," Marcus said. "Open the garage." "I'd love to help you with that," Marcus said. "But I think we should talk first." Marcus just made a critical move, sealing the garage with Sandra's Mercedes inside and forcing a direct confrontation. Right call? What's your strategy? Tell me in the comments. What followed was a 45-minute conversation on Marcus Webb's front porch, which he recorded on his phone, Ohio being a one-party consent state, and which covered, in approximate order, Sandra's demand that he open the garage immediately, Marcus's calm explanation that his garage door appeared to be experiencing a mechanical issue, Sandra's threat to call the police, Marcus's calm acknowledgement that she was welcome to do so, the arrival of a Crestfield PD officer named Vasquez at approximately 3:15 p.m. Officer Vasquez's review of the property deed, the recorded easement, Marcus's documentation of the vehicle's presence in his garage, Officer Vasquez's determination that no crime had been committed by either party present, but that trespassing and property damage were both potentially actionable concepts that both parties should consider carefully. Sandra Pruitt's escalating volume, Officer Vasquez's increasingly focused attention on Sandra Pruitt, and finally, Marcus's offer. The offer was simple. He would contact a garage door repair company to address the mechanical issue with his door. In exchange, Sandra Pruitt would withdraw all outstanding fines assessed against his property, issue a written acknowledgement that the violations had been improperly cited, provide the board correspondence he had requested, recuse herself from any future enforcement actions involving his property. Sandra Pruitt told him that was extortion. Marcus noted that he was merely offering to expedite a repair in exchange for a resolution of an unrelated administrative matter, that if she preferred, he was happy to call a repair company on Monday. It was currently Saturday afternoon, and get on whatever their scheduling availability happened to be. Officer Vasquez left. Sandra's Mercedes stayed. It stayed Sunday. It stayed through most of Monday. On Monday afternoon, Sandra Pruitt arrived at Marcus's door with a notarized letter withdrawing the 3 outstanding fines against his property, acknowledging that the vehicle classification notice had been issued in error, including a printed copy of 4 months of board email correspondence that she had, through what one can only assume was a moment of pressure, induced miscalculation, printed from her personal HOA email account and signed at the bottom. Marcus read the correspondence that evening. He called David Kessler. The emails were remarkable. They were remarkable in the specific way that private communications are remarkable when the people writing them do not anticipate anyone outside their circle reading them. Frank, strategic, wholly unconcerned with maintaining the fiction that fine enforcement was being conducted, according to the governing documents. There were references to targeting certain households. There was a thread about the Henderson wind chime fine that contained the sentence, "From Sandra to Gary Feld." I know it's not actually in the CC&Rs, but he's had those things up for 12 years and they drive me insane. There was a discussion of the Delgado Williams door color in which Sandra wrote that the ARC-C approval process doesn't matter. I control what gets approved and nothing's in writing. There was, most significantly, thread from November discussing the reserve fund. The association's long-term capital account, which the CC&Rs required to be maintained at a minimum of 70% funding, in which Sandra and Gary discussed using $18.00 from the reserve fund to repave the common area pathways adjacent to Sandra's property specifically, without a formal board vote and without member disclosure, which constituted both a breach of fiduciary duty and a potential violation of Ohio Revised Code Section 531209C. David Kessler's assessment the next morning was 3 sentences. "This is extraordinary. We need to share this with the right people. And you need to call a garage door company." Marcus called a garage door company. The technician, upon examining the epoxy application, said 4 words, "Man, what happened here?" He worked for 3 hours and billed $340, which Marcus paid cheerfully. The meeting that would later be described by the Crestfield Courier Tribune as the most chaotic HOA board meeting in Denton County recent memory was scheduled for January 8th at 7 p.m. in the Maplewood Ridge clubhouse. It was, nominally, the association's regular monthly meeting, agenda items including Q4 financial review, reserve fund status, and new business. By January 7th, 6 p.m., Marcus Webb had done the following thing. Shared David Kessler kinosis of analysis of the board correspondence with representatives of 14 other households who had received questionable fine notices. Connected the solar panel household with the Ohio State Attorney General's Consumer Protection section, which had an HOA compliance unit, sent a formal complaint with attached documentation to the Ohio Department of Commerce Division of Real Estate, which licensed property management companies regarding Keystone Property Solutions' failure to comply with the record inspection statute, reached out to a reporter at the Crestfield Courier-Tribune named Amy Fontaine, who covered suburban affairs and municipal governance, and who, upon receiving Marcus's email with the board correspondence attached, responded within 40 minutes. "This is a story. Can we talk tonight?" He had also, with David Kessler's assistance, submitted a formal recall petition for all 5 board members, signed by 61 homeowners, more than the 30% of the membership required under Section 14.4 of the CC&Rs to force a recall election. The board had not yet acknowledged receipt of the petition when Sandra Pruitt opened the January 8th meeting. She got approximately 4 minutes into her opening remarks, a prepared statement about community standards and fiscal responsibility, before Marcus Webb stood up. He stood in the back of the room, which was more full than any Maplewood Ridge board meeting had been in a decade. 47 residents had shown up. The clubhouse held 60, technically, but only if 60 people were comfortable with a fire code being a suggestion. People were standing along the walls. Barbara Henderson was there. The O'Caffers were there. The Delgado Williamses were there, Renata in her deep teal front door color jacket, which was either coincidental or deliberate. The solar panel household, the Pattersons, had brought a printout of Ohio Revised Code Section 4796.3. Marcus did not yell, he did not perform. He waited for Sandra to pause for breath, and then he said, clearly and evenly, "Point of order. I'd like to present a formal recall petition to the board, signed by 61 members of this association, calling for a special recall election for all 5 current board members." Sandra Pruitt looked at him. "This is not an agenda item. Recall petitions don't require agenda placement under Section 14.4 of our CC&Rs, Marcus said. They can be presented at any regular meeting. David," he nodded toward the back corner, where David Kessler had positioned himself with a legal pad. "Would you like to confirm that?" David Kessler confirmed that. The room had the quality of stillness that precedes significant things. Gary Feld looked at the ceiling. Cheryl Eaton looked at her notes. Sandra Pruitt said, "I am the president of this association, and I am telling you that this meeting will proceed according to the agenda." Marcus Webb placed a signed and notarized copy of the recall petition on the table in front of her. He placed, next to it, printed copy of David Kessler's 12-page legal analysis of the board's enforcement practices. He placed, next to that, copy of the email correspondence that Sandra had 11 days earlier voluntarily provided to him. He said, "I've also provided these materials to the Ohio AG's office, to the Ohio Department of Commerce, and to the Crestfield Courier-Tribune, whose reporter is present tonight. The printed copies are for the record." Amy Fontaine, standing against the left wall with a recorder in her hand, raised it slightly to indicate she was rolling. Sandra Pruitt looked at the recorder. She looked at the room. She looked at Marcus Webb, who was standing with his hands in his jacket pockets, the picture of a man who had done his paperwork. The meeting did not proceed according to the agenda. What happened instead took approximately 2.5 hours and included, at various points, Sandra Pruitt denying the email correspondence was genuine. 4 people in the room confirmed receiving fines referenced specifically in the emails. Gary Feld quietly stating that he had some concerns about the reserve fund decisions he wished to be on the record about. Cheryl Eaton asking whether board members could be individually liable for breach of fiduciary duty. David Kessler said yes. Barbara Henderson reading the wind chime fine notice aloud, and then holding up both the notice and her copy of the CC&Rs open to the section in question and asking where exactly the provision was. The Pattersons presenting Ohio Revised Code Section 479603 to the room. Amy Fontaine asking Sandra Pruitt on the record whether she had parked her vehicle in a neighbor's private garage, and Sandra Pruitt, approximately 9:20 p.m., announcing that she was resigning her position as board president effective immediately, citing personal reasons and a desire to focus on her family. Gary Feld resigned 11 minutes later. Cheryl Eaton did not resign. She turned to the room and asked what everyone wanted to do next. What everyone wanted to do next was have an election. The recall petition was formally accepted. A special election was scheduled for February 15th under the supervision of a neutral third-party election administrator, a requirement Marcus had included in the petition language. Having anticipated that an in-house vote would generate challenges, 4 new board members were elected. Marcus Webb, who ran for treasurer specifically, reasoning that if the problem was money, it should be watched by someone who understood the problem. Renata Delgado Williams, Thomas Okafor, a woman named Priya Nair from the far end of Sycamore Branch Lane, who had been watching the situation develop since November and brought to the board both a background in nonprofit financial management and a genuinely alarming amount of patience. The Amy Fontaine story ran in the Courier-Tribune on January 14th, above the fold with the headline, Crestfield HOA President Resigns Amid Fine Controversy, Recall Petition. It was picked up by 2 regional TV stations and a Columbus-based local news aggregator. The Columbus piece was clipped and shared approximately 11,000 times over the following week, primarily in HOA-adjacent Facebook groups and Reddit communities, where the detail about the Mercedes in the garage generated the kind of engagement social media algorithms reward enthusiastically. The Ohio AG's office opened a formal inquiry into the reserve fund misappropriation in February. Keystone Properties Solutions was issued a compliance notice by the Department of Commerce and subsequently terminated their management contract with Maplewood Ridge, a decision that, given what the new board found when they audited the books, was probably in everyone's interest. The $18,000 taken from the reserve fund for the pathway repaving was restored from board liability under a process David Kessler described as uncomfortable but effective. Gary Feld cooperated fully with the inquiry. Sandra Pruitt retained private counsel. Marcus Webb's outstanding fines, all $625, had been formally withdrawn in December. He framed the withdrawal letter and hung it in his garage, directly above the spot where the Mercedes had been parked. The Henderson wind chimes were still up. Nobody said anything about them. Patterson's solar panels were approved by the new ARC in March. Renata Delgado Williams, who chaired the committee, proved them in 48 hours. The Bronco was parked in the driveway through the entire spring while Marcus worked on the carburetor. Not one notice was issued. Marcus changed the garage door code again, anyway. Some lessons compound. There is a particular satisfaction in a system correcting itself. Not through a dramatic intervention from outside, but through the slow, document by document, meeting by meeting work of someone who simply refused to accept the proposition that rules applied differently to different people. It is not glamorous work. It is not cinematic in the way that a courtroom verdict is cinematic. It is a spreadsheet. It is a records request. It is showing up to a meeting with a folder and knowing, calmly and precisely, what is in the folder. The Maplewood Ridge Community Association sent its first newsletter under new management in April. It was 3 pages. It included a financial report, a reserve fund status update, showing 74% funding, a note about the upcoming spring cleanup day, and a reminder about grass height requirements. It did not include a fine schedule. It did not include a list of violations. It included at the bottom a note from the new board that read, "We serve the community. If you have concerns, our door is open." Marcus proofread the newsletter before it went out. He changed 2 typos and let everything else stand. His neighbors returned the bottle of wine from when he moved in. The Okafers had somehow kept, with a card that said, "Thank you for reading the CC&Rs." He drank it on the porch on a Tuesday evening in late April, while the wind chimes at 443 moved in the warm Ohio air. After everything Marcus went through, was it worth it? Have you fought your HOA? Won or walked away? Tell me your story. If you're watching this and your HOA board just came to mind, the president who suddenly discovered the rule book, the fines that appear and multiply, the enforcement that follows you personally and nobody else, take notes. The CC&Rs are a public document. The meeting minutes are a public document. The financial records are, in most states, your legal right to inspect. The board works for the community. If they have forgotten that, there is a process. There is always a process. Read your governing documents. Request your records. Talk to your neighbors. And maybe change your garage code. If this channel is documenting the HOA stories America needs to hear, subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Drop a comment with your city, HOA name if you dare, and what rule they've decided to die on. We are building a record.